Welcome Internet to Psychologist's Casual View, and today we're going to be reviewing a very informative book named Fairbairn's Object Relations in the Clinical Setting by David P. Celani. So anyway, what made the book very interesting, I felt, is that Celani is going to present Fairbairn's theories. So Fairbairn is a psychoanalyst that virtually created a whole new meta-psychology, and Celani goes into a lot of details about how it works, what are the bases of the theory, and what is very good, I felt, is also is going to critique Fairbairn's theory when he needs to, when he feels that things have not been quite as adjusted, or it hasn't gone far enough, or just the mistakes Fairbairn made in his theories. So that was very enjoyable to have someone that's, of course, going to prop up the meta-psychology of Fairbairn, but not shy away from positive, interesting, and important criticism. So those are the elements that really made the book an enjoyable read. And also, Celani, I feel, writes incredibly well. Like, you get his point, and he kind of tackles a bit of Fairbairn on his writing, saying that Fairbairn kind of needed an editor because he was complicated and often obscure to read. And anyway, I found that the whole book was a very good read, very well written, and you really get the ideas. So what are the fundamental ideas? So for Celani, Fairbairn is fundamental in his metapsychology to understand the idea of trauma. And what is those traumas? So for Celani and Fairbairn, and I'm going to try and dissociate both of them to try and explain the true points of view. Even though Celani is fundamentally a Fairbairnian, he still has a couple of details in which he does it in his own way, or he sees things in his own light. So for Fairbairn, basically, the psyche is not structured by the id, ego, and superego like Freud, but in another way. There is what Fairbairn calls the central ego. So what is the central ego? It's the most developed side of the self. It's the self that understands its needs, its limits, and can also put boundaries in place in order to protect itself from others and from certain inner other structures that we're going to see very shortly. So that central ego is basically the stable person in its mental psychic stability. And it's very important. It's the crux of a good enough identity. And that central ego is gonna fend off against two sub-egos, the anti-libidinal ego and the libidinal ego. So I'm gonna start with the libidinal ego. The libidinal ego is basically a part of the self that's going to wish for the relationships to always be positive, meaning that even if someone is treated in a very poor light, it's going to trigger sometimes the libidinal ego, which is an ego that wants the relationship, even if it's bad, even if it's terrible. Those bad elements are going to be pushed aside in order for the person to try and invest the object as much as possible, and disregarding all flaws and sometimes even projecting or fantasizing qualities that the object does not have. So the libidinal ego is very, very strong in this model, and it's the reason, for example, for Fairbairn, why people that are abused, aggressed, hurt, go back to their aggressors. Because that libidinal ego is so strong, because it rather have a bad relationship, a terrible relationship with others, rather than being alone. And that aloneness is, for the person, and for Fairbairn in his theories, the crux of destruction. And because for Fairbairn, there is no deeper anxiety than abandonment. So for Fairbairn, he has the idea that the bad object is still an object, and basically, even if it's bad, it still prevents the individual from caving in and being destroyed. So very interesting material. But that libidinal ego comes with its polar opposite, the anti-libidinal ego. So what is the anti-libidinal ego? The anti-libidinal ego is basically the inverted position of the other sub-ego. This version is hateful, resentful of the object, realizes all the flaws that the object has, and just seeks vengeance and retribution. And often it seeks vengeance and retribution on all objects, not just the person that harmed him, but everyone. So there's that push to fight the object, to destroy it in a way. And what Celani points out is that that struggle, that fight with the object, is basically something that the anti-libidinal ego is trapped in, meaning that it's not a separation, because separation would be the central ego, the moderate and more stable part of the person that would cut off, saying this does not fulfill my needs and is hurtful to me, so I'm gonna stop. The anti-libidinal ego is more like, I'm gonna continue this until you're destroyed. The libidinal ego, on the other hand, is going to say, I'm continuing this until you love me. So here we have three settings of the psyche, three instances. They're all egos, and for Fairbairn, only the central ego is conscious. The two others are unconscious. They're not in the id, because Fairbairn does not believe in an id, but they're unconscious, meaning the person is not aware of it and all of the bad objects. For Fairbairn, basically, the person is going to defend themselves not like Freud because of guilt. The unconscious mind is not based on guilt. It's based on trauma, and the trauma of reliving the experiences. So for Freud, it's a defense against guilt, and that's what causes repression. For Fairbairn, repression is a defense against a bad object, meaning of all the trauma that happened is pushed aside in order to let the libidinal ego run wild. And when it comes back, it's the anti-libidinal ego that starts to run amok. And both of them are super destructive for the central ego. So for Celani, he points out how this metapsychology is exclusive of the Freudian model. Because what you have to keep in mind is that for Fairbairn, there is no drives. I know it seems bizarre, at least it seemed very bizarre to me, but that's the case. There's no such thing as the life drive, the death drive, nor is there necessarily self-preservation drives. It's more about, for Fairbairn, the individual is object-seeking. And that seeking the object is the fundamental core. That's what sparks everything. But he does not believe at all that there is something like an urge that pushes us into sexual relationships or destructive relationships. For him, that's because we've internalized patterns in our egos, be it the central, the anti-libidinal, or the libidinal one. And those structures come with patterns. Those patterns are intertwined with three types of objects. So objects here, of course, being others, and mainly the parents, but not only. It can be the partners, it can be family members, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Anyway, for example, for Fairbairn, the central ego feeds and basically is built on what he calls the ideal object. So for Fairbairn, it's very different from Klein. For Fairbairn, the ideal object is an object that's good enough, to use Winnicott's term, to bring in balance within the individual, meaning there's no retribution, but there's no excitement either. Everything is at its right place, so to speak. So basically, it's going to help the individual internalize the love, the care, the kindness, the will to be with others, the joy, the happiness. All of that goes into the central ego, which, constituted enough, becomes a stable basis for one's identity and the core and the crux of security, of inner security. However, for Fairbairn, the problem comes with other types of objects, mainly the exciting objects. So what is the exciting object? It's an object that's going to trigger a whole range of positive, extreme emotions, like this feeling of love, of sexual desire, and so on and so forth. But always in a very frustrating and very unforgiving and flawed way. So it's going to tantalize the ego, saying, oh, if you love me more, then maybe, just maybe I'll love you back. Or just maybe I'll become a good parent. Or just maybe. And the child integrates that, oh, just maybe if I push the further, maybe if I give myself fully to the object, maybe I'm gonna get everything I want. That tantalization is basically the exciting object. So it's not just exciting in a sexual way, it's exciting in every possible way. It's really like sparking something, and it's a relationship that's basically always flawed. It's passionate and in a way very self-destructive, because no one can live up to that. And there's an illusion that's created between the individual and the other, which is untenable for both parties. And when the object is going to start becoming bad, wrong, hurtful, destructive, it's going to go into a rejecting object that's going to push aside the individual on the basis of, what were you expecting? I never loved you. I never cared for you. I can't bear you, and so on and so forth. It can even be sexual abuse, physical abuse, you name it. But it's what Fairbairn calls a rejecting object, meaning the object is going to push out the individual. And that pushing out is so massive that the individual is going to internalize the patterns of them basically being rejected. And that rejection is going to cause rage, frustration, destructiveness within the individual. That's then going to spiral at each time he sees the dynamic or the pattern between the rejecting object and themselves. And that dynamic is going to create the anti-libidinal ego, which is going to fight and use aggression, even sometimes against people that have not sparked being a rejecting object, or haven't sparked the anti-libidinal ego, so to speak. But the anti-libidinal ego needs to fight to, in a way, to pursue a relationship in everything that's so destructive. A relationship built and made by hate, basically, very simplistically, in a way. So here we have a trifecta of egos. And for Celani, this meta-psychology of Fairbairn's is based on the fact that for Fairbairn, the whole purpose of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is to break the model, break the pattern, in order for the patient to be able to emerge and to go beyond his inner world into the external world. And what makes it so interesting is that for Fairbairn, there's no internalization of the good object. I know, very strange. Like, you can internalize the bad, but you never internalize the good. The good comes from the outside world. The good is in reality, so to speak, and it needs to break into the inner world and break the inner world in order for everything to start working again. Celani disagrees with that. For Celani, there is such a thing as internalizing a good object, and that's the whole core of psychotherapy. He put it in a very interesting way. He said that Celani, I'm talking about here, says that basically the whole goal of psychotherapy is to create a positive projective identification, meaning the therapist is going to see something good in the patient, something wonderful, something loving, and they're going to throw that will to change into the patient, and the patient is going to be able, with that will to change, with that love, with that kindness that the therapist sees, being able to build the central ego, to make that central ego that's the stable basis of the person a reality, something that's solid enough. And Celani goes into so many details. It's a text that's so incredibly rich in terms of clinical examples. Like, there's, I think, a dozen of them, and every single one of them is so interesting. And he basically says that it can help for people with borderline disorder, personality disorder, people with obsessive obsessive personality disorder, histrionic disorders. So for him, basically the borderline has had a childhood where, because he goes into those fine details, a childhood in which he's been gravely abused. And that abuse was punctuated, meaning there was very small, short moments of happiness. And that happiness, and in contrast with a massive amount of trauma, created a dynamic where the libidinal ego was fed just enough for it to create the libidinal ego. And there's such a massive trauma that the anti-libidinal ego is created as well. And that's how it plays out for the borderline, meaning that there is also very fundamentally a hope of being loved even by the most hateful object. And what Celani points out is the more the object hated, neglected, abused the individual, the more it's going to spark the libidinal ego. And that sparking of the libidinal ego is very complicated for therapists to work with, because it can seem as if all the work done with the patient was for nothing, because basically the libidinal ego is not going to allow for any criticism of the exciting object, because in that exciting object is a chance of being loved. And the person really, really believes it, meaning that the therapist can't make a dent in it. And what Celani says, and what he advises, is basically for the therapist to keep it in mind, identify it as such, but not attack it straight away, because that would spark a negative transference and the person would leave in the worst possible moment. The moment before he is abused again, and that re-sparks the anti-libidinal ego. So for him, there has to be like not a confrontation, but you have to keep it in mind. And what he says is that by interpreting softly at the start and more as therapy goes on, the person is able to make something of those interpretations and start piling up elements that are going to be the building blocks of the central ego. But he says that you have to be like very patient. It's not going to be in a flip of a finger. It's going to be long, arduous, and sometimes therapists are going to be hopeless, because that's what the patient feels, hopeless within that pattern of repetition. And what becomes interesting is that you might think, after all I've said, that, well, it's okay, because the therapist is going to use the anti-libidinal ego to cut out the libidinal ego. It doesn't work that way. Both are splits. Both do not communicate in the mind of the patient, as if the two images were just broken off on two separate islands. That means you can't even use the anti-libidinal ego. And even worse, that anti-libidinal ego is not helpful either, because its goal is not separation. Its goal is destruction of the other, meaning it's a spiral, because destruction is not going to necessarily happen, but it seeks revenge, it seeks repetition. And the problem is when the object starts yielding, or at least giving the feeling that it yields, it's going to re-spark the libidinal ego. So it's a pattern in which only the positive sides of the therapist, it's going to be patient, it's going to be rightfully interpretive, but not severe, not punishing, not punitive, is going to create a good object within the patient, a good object that's going to start to notice that, well, he can be treated differently, the patient, and he's going to start expecting that from the object, shifting the two objects, rejecting and basically exciting, into dismiss them and just focus on the ideal object, which is going to be good enough and stable enough to build a good relationship with it. So that's for the borderlines. But for the obsessive, he says that it's very peculiar, because they've received so little love that it seems that there is no such thing as the libidinal ego. There's only the anti-libidinal ego, because of something he calls moral narcissism, meaning that the parents of the obsessive basically shifted the rules of the game of morality, of it being a universal to a personal, meaning that for the narcissist morality is based on whatever makes me happy is good. Not what is good, right? What makes me happy is good. And that makes it the obsessive is going to integrate rules upon rules upon rules to try and understand how basically the world works, but also contradicting itself because of that moral narcissism. And that piling up of contradictions is going to force him to create a reason and a system in which basically love is excluded, love is just rejected. And as such, the whole point of the obsessive is that he becomes an expert, but at the cost of his relationships. And the whole goal here is to try and reintroduce love into all of that, to try and make it more tolerable for the obsessive. And finally, for the histrionic, it's about how, at least according to Celani, because that's his fundamental idea, that father figures in the histrionics have been seductive and also very rejecting, meaning that on the surface they might have been very given to their daughters, very, I can say, present, but they're also like, you have to now do what I want, you have to obey my rules. And they've been also very dismissive of the mother, meaning that the fathers have been both an exciting object and a rejecting object at the same time. And that rejection of the mother and then of the daughter creates a very strong libidinal ego within the histrionic, but a very core fear of being seduced. And basically that's how Celani explains those movements that certain histrionics might have of seducing a man and then acting angrily when the man proposes a sexual relationship. Because basically it starts with the histrionic activating her libidinal ego and becoming the exciting object, basically. And when she discovers that the man is interested in her, she feels exploited. She feels hurt and diminished. And so she reacts with her anti-libidinal ego. Because that's the thing, libidinal and anti-libidinal can come in and come out at any moment. And they can both of them can overpower the central ego. And the whole goal of therapy is for the central ego to remain stable enough to not be overpowered by them and to remain in control, so to speak. So that's basically the gist of it. And he says that although Fairbairn's metapsychology basically it's not even it got kicked out, because like it was not even that rejected. It's just that the psychoanalysis completely ignored it. Mainly because Klein kind of dismissed the ideas of Fairbairn. And Anna Freud, just didn't care at all. So basically these theories and ideas remained dormant until, funnily enough, Otto Kernberg started using bits and pieces of Fairbairn's model. And then it re-sparked all of the interest. And for Celani, Fairbairn's model is basically a fundamental model to understand trauma and the human mind. And that Fairbairn himself put the child not as a drive destructive demon, as he says in the book. I don't fully agree with Celani, but that's what he states, that the child is like a demon for classic psychoanalysis. And it puts him in a position of innocence, in which he is basically modeled after his relationships. And although I find the ideas of Fairbairn fundamental, interesting, and completely, absolutely worth knowing, studying, and even using in a clinical setting, I do feel that it kind of lacks because try to explain our movements, our psychic movements, as the spark that lights the fire of the psyche. I don't think in Fairbairn's model explains it quite as well. That even though objects, I think, are fundamental in the relationship, perhaps more than drives, I agree with that. I don't think that that means that there is no drives. I just wanted to make my position very clear, and I might talk about it at another moment than in this video. But anyway, I felt that I knew quite well-ish Fairbairn's model, but this book really made it solid. Like, I really have the feeling after reading this that I kind of really get Fairbairn and his model. And I think it's a wonderful model, and I would encourage any analyst or anyone interested in what I've just said to read it. I would really encourage it because I felt that it was a kind of a great book. And he also goes into whole details of patients and therapists and how one can basically find oneself in the position of an anti-libidinal ego or a libidinal ego as a therapist, which is very interesting, and the patient is the rejecting or the exciting object, and inversely. So all of that is super interesting, and basically I found that the book is a great read. So that's pretty much it for the review, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!